Hi guys. Now today we're just going to focus on some of the important themes in the play Othello, and we're also going to do just a run through of the important plot details. Okay, so remember this is going to be kind of important when you're making references, then when you're analysing the extract from Othello itself, because you may be asked to focus on themes then that emerge in the extract. You may be asked to focus on, we'd say, characters, traits and behaviour. Maybe we'd say relationships between the characters, obviously interpreting the lines then, and maybe even imagery and symbolism when it comes to the extract as well. Okay, so when we're looking at the play Othello, the obvious theme, of course, would be discrimination and intolerance. And the obvious example of that would be racism itself. Okay, so there are plenty of examples of that from the very beginning of the play in terms of the other characters and their relationship with Othello or their attitude towards Othello. A key theme would be the theme of revenge as well. That kind of goes hand in hand with the theme of betrayal or disloyalty. Because think about it, of course, we have to look at the characters' motivations and why they behave as they do and why they're seeking revenge. So at the very end, of course, we see Othello seeking revenge then because Iago has betrayed him. But we see Iago seeking revenge at the very beginning of the play because he believes that Othello has betrayed him. So it's a matter of perspective, and there are lots of different examples of revenge and betrayal throughout the play. A key theme, which would be a classic Shakespearean theme, would be appearance versus reality. Now, when we think about appearance versus reality, it relates back to Iago's famous saying, "I am not what I am." In other words, I am not who I appear to be. So, on the face of it, he seems to be dutiful and loyal, a good friend and companion to Othello, but of course in reality, behind the scenes, he's plotting and scheming then, of course, to overthrow him. So it's reinforcing then that a number of characters are treacherous, a number of characters are devious or duplicitous, and a number of them cannot be trusted. Also, conversely, then we can see in terms of the theme of appearance versus reality, we could say someone like Desdemona in Othello's eyes appears to be, of course, disloyal. But the reality is that she is sweet-natured, kind, very biddable, and actually a very principled and honourable character. In terms of appearance versus reality, we can look, of course, at then the plotting and the scheming of various characters throughout the play. So that obviously relates back to plot details then. So if you know your characters and you know your plot details, then any theme is approachable, and any theme, of course, is actually very straightforward. The key theme, of course, in terms of Othello would be jealousy and envy as well. And we have to think about which particular characters are motivated by jealousy and what part does jealousy or envy then play within the plot itself. How does it affect the plot? How does it propel the plot along? Okay, what are the important examples of jealousy and envy then as the play progresses? How does it affect the outcome of the play? How does it influence the characters and their relationships within the play? Okay, so those are some of the main themes. Now, obviously, as opposed to sort of 4 or 5 different themes, you could focus on about 20 different themes. But what you should do is just be mindful, we say, of 1 or 2 and how you could relate it back to plot and characters. Okay, so just an overview of Act 1. Remember that we looked at the opening scene, Act 1, Scene 1, and we were focusing on the elopement then. That was the news, the elopement of Othello and Desdemona. And remember that our father was informed then by Iago and Rodrigo. We know that Iago and Rodrigo are plotting then to undermine Othello because Rodrigo states that he's in love. He claims to be in love with Desdemona. So remember that Brabantio is incensed then because he invited Othello into his house. And obviously, of course, they were firm friends. And then he sees Othello, of course, as deceiving him and seducing his daughter. He accuses him of witchcraft. Basically, then we see the estrangement of Othello and Brabantio because Desdemona then defends Othello in front of her father. They go to the Senate, and then the Duke of Venice sides with Othello and Desdemona. Okay, So basically then at the end of that particular, I think it's Act 1, Scene 2, then we find out that Othello then is the general of the Venetian fleet, Venetian army, think of fleet of ships, and they're going to fight the Turks, so think of the Ottoman Empire, who are now laying claim to Cyprus. So they want to seize control of Cyprus, and the Venetian army, of course, has to stop them. Okay, so that brings us up then to the end of Act 1. Okay, so basically then in Act 2, we realise that the Turks have been defeated, but they weren't necessarily defeated by the Venetian army, they were simply defeated by bad weather. Okay, so a storm then, of course, shipwrecked the Turkish fleet. And we can see then that the action moves to Cyprus itself, the small island of Cyprus. So Desdemona then asked to travel to Cyprus with Othello. So the two of them then will essentially honeymoon in Cyprus. Then we see Iago's plan then as well. He tells Rodrigo essentially that Michael Cassio is in love with Desdemona. And he is going to use then Rodrigo to instigate a fight with Michael Cassio. And that will result in Michael Cassio losing his position as Othello's lieutenant. Okay, so that's a key important detail, a key plot detail when it comes to Act 2, because we're emphasizing then that Rodrigo is part of Iago's plan in a very real sense. So Iago, remember, is a very observant man, okay, very careful, very methodical, but also opportunistic. So he knows that Michael Cassio is a lightweight when it comes to drink. So he encourages him to drink more during the celebrations. Remember, they're celebrating the fact that they've defeated the Turks and that Cyprus then remains under Venetian rule. So Michael Cassio very foolishly drinks to excess. Rodrigo provokes him. Michael Cassio responds. They start a fight. And Montano then is actually injured. So when Othello then, who's disturbed, having gone to bed with Desdemona, comes back and is angry at Michael Cassio, holds him responsible then, of course, for provoking the fight and, of course, being involved, even though Rodrigo was the person who instigated it, and injuring Montano, then Michael Cassio loses his job. And guess who's promoted in his stead? Obviously, Iago. So it's reinforcing the idea then that Iago's plan is working. He has Rodrigo on side. Okay, Michael Cassio has lost his job. He's been humiliated. And Iago has actually been promoted. Okay, so we learned at the very beginning of the play that's what angered Iago the most, that he had been passed over for promotion. So now that Michael Cassio is demoted, of course, then Iago should be satisfied. Okay, so that's reinforcing then Act 2. Now remember that Iago goes one step further by trying to ruin the reputation of Michael Cassio. And he tells everyone, of course, that Michael Cassio is hot-headed, can't be trusted. This is very typical. So he tries to ruin his reputation in that way then. Okay, so Rodrigo then is reassured by Iago. Iago plans to ask Emilia then to get Desdemona to help Michael Cassio. So he's plotting the downfall of Othello here. So he says then simply to Emilia, his wife, who remember is the lady in waiting then and friend to Desdemona, encourage Desdemona then to intercede on Michael Cassio's behalf. Ask her to make sure that Othello then, of course, listens to her pleas to reinstate Michael Cassio. Now, think about it. We know, of course, in the very beginning of the play, that Iago is very perceptive, and he knows that Othello is a very jealous and insecure man. What do we know about Michael Cassio? We know, of course, that he is from Florentine. We know that he is a gentleman. We know that he is handsome, and we know that he is charming. So he's very successful with women. Remember, he's currently in a relationship of sorts with Bianca the courtesan. So we know, of course, that when Desdemona asks Othello then to reinstate Michael Cassio, Othello is going to become very suspicious. He's going to wonder about Desdemona's motives. Why does she continually ask for Michael Cassio to get his job back? There must be something more to this than meets the eye. And here's where Iago comes in, of course, and begins to suggest to Othello that Michael Cassio is actually having an affair with Desdemona. Okay, so it's all about suggestion. It's all about the kind of the subtle approach then used by Iago. Okay, so Desdemona asks Othello then to reinstate Michael Cassio, but he refuses. And why does he do so? Because he believes that that would ruin his reputation. Emilia then arranges a meeting between Desdemona and Michael Cassio. Desdemona reassures Michael Cassio and says, yes, you will definitely be reinstated. Othello sees Desdemona and Michael Cassio talking, becomes suspicious. Desdemona insists that Othello reinstates Michael Cassio. Iago plants a seed of doubt in Othello's head. So it's kind of germinating, it's growing, of course, in terms of his suspicion. Ironically then, he warns Othello about jealousy. Beware, my lord, of the green-eyed monster. It doth mock the meat it feeds on. So it's emphasizing the notion here, of course, that he is fully aware of Othello's fatal flaw. Emilia then gives Iago Desdemona's handkerchief. So Iago had asked Emilia then, of course, to steal that handkerchief that was a gift from Othello to Desdemona. Okay, so it's a white handkerchief that's dotted with strawberries, and strawberries are associated, of course, with aphrodisiacs, so they're associated with love and passion. But apparently the snake in the Garden of Eden emerged from a strawberry bed, so the symbolism is very strong in terms of betrayal or deceit or treachery as well. So what does Michael Cassio, of course, think then? When Iago produces this particular handkerchief and leaves it in his chamber, Michael Cassio just picks it up, thinking, of course, that it's just a handkerchief, and uses it. So Iago then, of course, has planted this particular handkerchief in Michael Cassio's apartment or chamber. He finds it and begins using it in public. Othello is encouraged by Iago to ask Desdemona about the gift, about the handkerchief. She can't find it, so she lies and says that she left it behind in Venice. Okay, so there's a lot of suspicion then, of course, about Michael Cassio and Desdemona then. Iago then pretends that he overheard Michael Cassio talking in his sleep about Desdemona. He tells this to Othello. Othello then is very rash. He believes Iago, it's emphasizing how credulous, how trusting he is, and he vows then to kill both Michael Cassio and Desdemona. He's fully convinced that they're having a fully fledged affair. Okay, so think about it. The plan is working. Iago is now Othello's lieutenant. Desdemona is asking, pleading with Othello at every moment then about Michael Cassio, kind of enraging him further. And then she lies about the missing handkerchief when he asks her directly. So that casts more doubt then, of course, and he believes that she is actually having an affair with Michael Cassio. So Michael Cassio and Bianca then argue about the fact that he's ignoring her. He gives Bianca the handkerchief and asks her to make a copy of it. So the handkerchief just becomes an important plot detail essentially here, as well as a symbol. Moving on to Act 4 then. Iago drops hints to Othello, and Othello then becomes enraged. He actually swoons and faints essentially then, the more angry he becomes. And this is supposed to represent essentially his weakness then, stemming from the jealousy and the insecurity. So Iago is then staging this particular performance. So he arranges then a meeting, a conversation with Michael Cassio, and Othello is supposed to eavesdrop on the conversation, to listen in essentially on the conversation. So Iago begins a conversation with Michael Cassio about Bianca, but Othello believes that the conversation is about Desdemona. And think about it, Michael Cassio is having a relationship with Bianca. So therefore, Othello is convinced, fully convinced at this particular stage of the play, that Michael Cassio is sleeping with his wife. Okay, so that's actually very important there. So Iago states then, this is part of the plan, that he will kill Michael Cassio, and he suggests to Othello that he strangle his own wife in their bed. So he suggests that Othello kills Desdemona, and Othello agrees. Okay, so towards the end of Act 4 then, Lodovico, who is Desdemona's cousin, arrives then in Cyprus and tells Othello that he's been recalled to Venice and that Michael Cassio is now the governor of Cyprus. Othello is angry that Desdemona praises Michael Cassio in public, and he hits her, he strikes her across the face. Othello tells Desdemona to go to her room and then leaves. Iago then lies about Othello's rage. So he tells Lodovico and Gratiano, who are Desdemona's relatives, that Othello behaves in this rash fashion, violent fashion all the time. Remember, he was trying to ruin Michael Cassio's reputation. Now he's trying to ruin Othello's reputation. But more or less Othello is doing that on his own right as well. Okay, so in Act 5 then, remember, Iago is trying then to put his plan into operation, that he is going to kill Michael Cassio and that Othello is going to kill Desdemona. What does he do instead though? He arranges for Roderigo to kill Michael Cassio, because remember, Roderigo is fully convinced that Michael Cassio and Desdemona are having an affair. So he wants rid of both Michael Cassio and Othello. So at night then on the street, we see Roderigo then attacking Michael Cassio. Okay, so the whole point is then, of course, that Roderigo is injured. Michael Cassio is injured then by Iago, who stabs him in the leg. And then the others appear on the scene in the darkness. Everyone is very confused as to what's happening. Michael Cassio has been injured, and Iago then, to cover his tracks, actually stabs Roderigo to death. So Roderigo is dead because he's surplused requirements. He has just done what Iago wanted him to do. Michael Cassio is injured. And then we move back to Othello. Okay, so Othello then basically tells Desdemona in his room that he is aware of her so-called affair with Michael Cassio. Okay, so they're alone then. And he tells her to say her prayers before he kills her. He then smothers her with a pillow. Emilia then comes back to tell them about Michael Cassio and is distraught to find Desdemona obviously dying. Montano, Gratiano and Iago enter. Emilia then reveals the truth about the handkerchief, because Othello was saying, of course, that Iago said that Desdemona and Michael Cassio are having an affair. So Emilia is there to tell the truth. That's actually very important. So she reveals that Iago told her to steal the handkerchief, because remember, that was the piece of evidence that Othello was using then to justify his actions, that his wife was unfaithful to him. So in order to silence Emilia then, Iago stabs her. So he kills her. So think about it. Iago has killed Roderigo to cover his tracks, and now he's attempting to silence Emilia. So he kills her, making sure that she can't tell more, of course, in terms of his plot or his scheme. It's a little bit too late though. Okay. So Iago refuses to explain his actions. Othello then tries to kill him. He realizes that he has been tricked by Iago, but he is disarmed. Okay, he manages to wound him, but he's disarmed. Iago is referred to as a viper and a devil and a dog. Okay, Lodovico then, of course, says to Othello, "Where is this rash and most unfortunate man?" Othello says, "That's he that was Othello, here I am." So he fully admits, of course, that he was in the wrong, that he killed his wife, believing that she was having an affair with Michael Cassio. So he calls himself a fool, realizes what he has done, and the only option then, because remember, he is a warrior or a soldier, so like the ancient Romans who would rather kill themselves, commit suicide, than submit to the enemy, he falls on his sword, so stabs himself and dies. So remember, Iago tried to escape and was recaptured. They try to force him to explain his motives, the reason for his actions, but he refuses. He remains silent. Michael Cassio then pays tribute to Othello. He was great of heart. That's Michael Cassio, becomes ruler of Cyprus. Othello, remember, they were hoping that they could bring Othello back to Venice, obviously, so he could account for his actions. But remember, he has killed himself. So if you think about it, at the very end of the play then, it's very dramatic on stage, because you have the lifeless body of Desdemona, okay, the innocent victim. Then you have Emilia, who is simply, of course, defending her friend, Desdemona. And you also have then, of course, the tragic figure of Othello, who killed himself because he obviously realized the terrible mistake and the terrible injustice that was done to Desdemona. Okay, so it's just emphasizing the basic plot details there, just to make sure that you're au fait with the general storyline, the kind of the outline of the play itself. So remember, and I've mentioned this then in the email that I've sent you in terms of revising for that, make sure that you know, of course, the simple plot details, okay? Make sure that you know the basic traits when it comes to the characters. Make sure that you're able to focus on one or two of the key themes, and obviously practice by reading over some of the scenes in the Shakespeare app and just testing yourself. So in tomorrow's class, I'm going to focus on the unseen poem, how you should approach that and what you need to revise in terms of poetic techniques as well. So I'll talk to you then, guys. See you.